Good evening from Warsaw, Poland. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight. The new French Prime Minister wants to break down the glass ceiling between the society and the government. This will be a challenge because Bayrou is France's fourth Prime Minister in the last 2 years and his predecessor ruled only for 90 days. More on this in just a moment, but first let's take a look at the latest headlines. Violence escalates ahead of presidential vote in Georgia. Poland's former prime minister and 10 others will face prosecution over the cash for visas irregularities. Poland's biggest video game maker released a trailer for a new game in the blockbuster Witcher fantasy series. France has a new prime minister, centrist politician François Bayrou, after the ousting of his predecessor in a dramatic no-confidence vote last week. Bayrou has a tough task ahead of him: unite a deeply divided country and parliament. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Damon, reports.
In the face of domestic deadlocks and disputes, the third French Prime Minister appointed this year, handing over to the fourth. Meet François Bayrou.
Everyone knows the road will be long, but I'm not the first to take a long road.
The 73-year-old centrist politician will attempt to lead a hung parliament and pass the country's next budget, with no single party holding a majority following President Emmanuel Macron's snap election in June.
He's a stalwart in terms of the political scene, but he hasn't performed well in terms of legislative elections in the past.
The rapid changing of the guard comes after Michel Barnier was toppled in a no-confidence vote last week over the same budget negotiations that François Bayrou will now have to preside over.
Yeah, politicians of France have never seen quite like this, and it certainly means that pushing through any agenda and keeping a prime minister in place is practically impossible until the next legislative elections.
On the street, reactions to Bayrou's appointment are mixed.
Okay.
He's a man of synthesis with a bit of political experience. The same people keep coming back.
And across the political aisle, his opponents, including the far right, have already weighed in.
I'm above all calling on the new Prime Minister not to be a dummy of Macronism, because the French people expressed themselves in huge numbers in elections last summer, hoping for change, a reasonable but firm break from the president's policies.
Similarly to Poland, France has a two-headed political system, where the Prime Minister takes charge of day-to-day politics, while the President's focus is representing the country on the world stage. On Thursday, President Macron was doing just that, meeting in Poland with Prime Minister Donald Tusk and President Andrzej Duda to discuss the war in Ukraine.
The only possible peace in Ukraine is a sustainable peace, that is to say, a peace which is negotiated by the Ukrainians and which allows them to have security solutions for the long term.
His role of diplomat and potential peacemaker is one President Macron intends to keep, insisting that he will stay in the Élysée Palace until the end of his term in 2027.
We now move to Georgia, where protesters marched today through the capital city of Tbilisi, demanding the resignation of the government and a redo of the elections. The protests blocked key roadways and paralyzed the city before culminating in the main demonstration outside of the parliament building. Our correspondent, Don Arleth, has more.
Day 16 of these mass protests here in the Georgian capital continue. These protests today very peaceful, as have been, I'm told, over the last several days. Of course, a European Union delegation here to observe the protests and to take stock of exactly what's happening here as they consider what to do next as far as sanctions are concerned on the members of the Georgian Dream government. Now, what makes today's protest so different is you had at least a dozen or so marches throughout the streets of Tbilisi in several key locations, paralyzing traffic. You had artists, you had members of the National Education Center, you had workers of the marketing sector, workers of the EU Representation Office, academics from University Alte, you had the Georgian University academics also out in the streets, workers from the IT sector. They were successful in paralyzing traffic. Now these protests have reached somewhat of a critical juncture as they've been going on for well over 2 weeks now. Will this momentum continue? Next week will also be a pivotal week as President Salome Zhorbaishvili's term is supposed to end. The Georgian Dream wants to force in their own candidate in the presidency, but she says she is not stepping down. She addressed the nation earlier tonight in a televised speech to commemorate Human Rights Day, International Human Rights Day, and she said that those human rights haven't been respected by the Georgian Dream in these protests over the last 2 weeks. But tonight, as we see here in front of the parliament, normally you would see police standing on both sides of the parliament with water cannons and a heavy police presence. That has completely disappeared, and people are just marching through the streets, expressing against their anger against the Georgian Dream government, but no brutal crackdown as we can see yet here in Georgia. Reporting from Tbilisi, Don Arleth, TVP World.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the bloc needs to significantly increase its defense spending to compete with Moscow. According to Rutte himself, in 2025, Russia's total military spending will reach upwards of 8% of the country's GDP. Franciszek Pilis has the report.
3, 2, 1.
As Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is just a few months away from entering its third year, Moscow's war machine is nowhere near stopping.
I'll be honest, the security situation does not look good. It's undoubtedly the worst in my lifetime, and I suspect in yours too.
On the contrary, it seems to be picking up pace for 2025.
In 2025, the total military spending will be 7 to 8% of GDP, if not more. That's a third of Russia's state budget, and the highest level since the Cold War.
Russia's increased military spending shouldn't be a reason to falter, however. While individual NATO member states' military spending seems minuscule in comparison with Russia, the whole of the bloc is still technically ahead of Moscow in terms of money spent, according to reports from CIPRI.
All NATO spends around $1.5 trillion on defense budgets, while Russia is spending more than 100 billion. So it's circa 10 times more when we look at NATO spending. But we need to take into consideration power purchase parity, which is higher in comparison in Russia. So it's circa 10 times more spending in NATO.
Despite this, the alliance shouldn't rest on its laurels. While Mark Rutte hasn't officially given a specific figure member states should aim to spend on defense, he stressed that every NATO member should consider substantially upping its defense spending. And security experts agree.
Does it mean Europe or NATO in particular would lose 4 to 5 years out? No. But the pain factor would be high, the damage would be real, the cost in human lives would be horrific. And so he's right to be calling for a market change to NATO's defense spending.
Another aspect that could help NATO bolster its military capabilities without pressure to deliver weapons to a country in need could be a rumored ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, brokered by US President-elect Donald Trump. Hungary's Viktor Orbán, who's been on a self-imposed peacemaking mission for the last few months, has also come forward with a proposal for a Christmas ceasefire, an idea backed by the Kremlin.
NATO needs to use this time of possible ceasefire effectively, because on this effectiveness of NATO spending to strengthen Ukraine during possible ceasefire depends the future of Ukraine, its sovereignty, and as well security of NATO.
While scenarios like this are far from realized and mostly speculative, one thing remains clear. NATO needs to increase their military spending, and it needs to start doing it fast.
A major investigation of Russia's hybrid war on the West has mapped nearly 150 suspected and attributed attacks since Moscow invaded Ukraine. Analysts say NATO needs to coordinate a unified response to head off escalation by the Kremlin, and that Poland's move to shut the Russian consulate in Poznań offers a model for other countries. John Todd has more.
Residents in Kyiv escape a rush-hour attack on Friday morning as the Kremlin launches another massive air assault on Ukraine's power network. Among those sheltering from Russia's hot war were the new EU ambassador to Ukraine, Katerina Matharnova, and the EU Defence Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius. Now a new report's been published that reveals the extent of the Kremlin's hybrid war on the West. Researchers at the US Helsinki Commission identified nearly 150 incidents, either attributed to Moscow or where Russia is suspected to have had a hand. Experts say there's been a dramatic rise in incidents.
The number of cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure, but also military, increased over 200% times comparing to the period before the invasion.
Disinformation campaigns and infrastructure attacks each account for around a third of all incidents, while violence and Russia's use of migration make up 20% and 12% respectively. Examples include recent alleged interference in Romania's presidential election and an assassination plot against the German arms manufacturing executive Armin Papaga, whose corporation has led artillery shell production for Kyiv. This summer, Poland saw a surge to nearly 400 illegal crossings a day along its border with Belarus. In May, a Polish soldier was fatally stabbed by a migrant. Analysts say NATO needs to step up its response, for example, by taking out so-called troll farms.
Such actions without giving response probably will lead to further escalation and further crossing of red lines, because Russia is testing our response mechanisms. So I believe that we should consider response for such actions.
Dr. Brieke says NATO members should follow Poland's example by boosting their counterintelligence capacity. He also suggests that the closure of the Russian consulate in Poznan in response to a suspected arson plot could prove a model for other countries.
I believe that this is, on the political level, it's also an important countermeasure and sending strategic signal to Russia that we will not allow them to cause such subversive actions without any response.
The US Helsinki Commission agrees as the investigation into the recent suspected sabotage of Baltic Sea cables continues. It says NATO countries should take the shadow war seriously and beef up support for Ukraine.
Syrians across the country are celebrating the victory of the Syrian revolution and an end to 13 years of civil war after the regime of Bashar al-Assad was toppled on Sunday. Our correspondent Oz Katerji is in Damascus and has more.
I am here in the heart of Damascus at Umayyad Square, where tens of thousands of Syrians have descended to celebrate their victory, the victory of the Syrian revolution and the downfall of Assad's regime. After 13 years of civil war, the Syrians finally have a victory to celebrate. There is so much left to do in this country. There is so much to rebuild from the ground up. But for today, for now, they're grieving their loved ones that they lost during the course of the war, and they're celebrating their victory. Oz Katerji reporting from Damascus for TVP World.
The Polish National Prosecutor's Office has been officially notified of potential involvement of 11 high-profile members of the former Law and Justice government in the so-called cash for visas scandal. Among the persons of interest is former Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki. Our reporter Karolina Stoltzman has more.
A dedicated parliamentary committee in Poland has pushed for indictment of various officials of the previous government for their alleged role in the illicit sale of visas, the head of the committee announced on X.com.
Today, we are filing a notification to the National Public Prosecutor regarding 11 individuals. The list includes Zbigniew Rau, Mateusz Morawiecki, Mariusz Kamiński, Jadwiga Emilewicz, Andrzej Stróżny and Lech Kołakowski. The law must apply equally to everyone. #Visagate.
11 notices were sent to the prosecutor's office. 3 of them concern former Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, former Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau, and former Interior Minister Mariusz Kamiński. The charges are abuse of rights and neglect of duty to the detriment of the public interest and for financial gain, as well as passive influence peddling. According to the committee's final report, the Law and Justice government let 3,610,000 people into Poland during its tenure, with individual officials profiting off issued visas. The prosecutor's office will now look into the suspects reported by the parliamentary committee.
Despite his troubles at home, the former Polish Prime Minister is being considered in Brussels as a potential candidate for the leadership of the Eurosceptic ECR group. Our European Affairs correspondent Sasha Farbach reports.
Now, in June's European parliamentary elections, there was more of a shift away from the centre, more to the right of the political spectrum. One of those beneficiaries was the ECR, with 83 seats out of 720, gaining 9. Now, this is traditionally seen as the Eurosceptic party, the European Conservatives and Reformists. Now, this also matters, and the head of that party, particularly now in the group across Europe, is Prime Minister Meloni of Italy. Now, she's said to be stepping away and stepping down from that position, very much saying that she cannot be both Prime Minister and head of this grouping, and very much also as she's consolidated herself as very much a bridge maker in Europe, a powerful politician in Europe. And the name that might be now due to replace her is former Prime Minister of Poland, Mr. Mateusz Morawiecki. Now, those two individuals have shared a close working bond, and even after he had stepped down as Prime Minister, there were still off the sidelines of European Council summits meetings between Ms. Meloni and Mr. Morawiecki, showing very much there is a positive working bond now with both Italy and Poland. They have the largest delegates in that grouping. So very much, if this is to be the case, a done deal, then by Sunday we would probably know if Mr. Morawiecki will be heading the ECR. Now, that matters as well because he would then potentially receive an invitation to the inauguration of President Donald Trump in Washington on January 20th. Now, this could give him access to Mr. Trump and also probably will do that as political leverage, giving Mr. Morawiecki and ECR closer contact to the new president. Also, traditionally, the Republicans, a party that has been closely affiliated with ECR in the past, and also looking at that as potential probably political leverage that Mr. Morawiecki is trying to utilize in terms of not just for Europe, but also domestic policy in Poland. And that's the latest here from Brussels. Sasha Farbach for TVP World.
The Witcher has returned. A trailer for the new Witcher video game has set the gaming community abuzz after its debut at the Game Awards in Los Angeles. The highly anticipated sequel marks a fresh storyline for the franchise, which has sold over 75 million copies worldwide since its debut in 2007. Jeremy Hołodniuk reports.
The day has finally come. The first trailer for the highly anticipated new Witcher game has been released by CD Projekt Red.
Forgive me, daughter.
The latest entry to the Witcher saga, based on the novels by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski about a monster hunter Geralt, marks the beginning of a new storyline in which his daughter Ciri takes center stage.
It was such an important moment for us to actually tell the world that Ciri, who is our main protagonist, is the one that we chose. It was such an obvious choice right from the beginning for the new Witcher saga.
I fight for those I hold dear.
Although the first Witcher game was released back in the 2000s, it was the third part of the series that became an international success, selling over 50 million copies worldwide. No wonder the new trailer made a lot of noise.
From our perspective, it's cool to see a Polish game that has gained recognition worldwide. And from the point of view of an outsider, especially from the West, it's something exotic. Games like the ones made by Poles, specifically CD Projekt, are not something you come across every day.
The Witcher 4 has only just entered full production, which means it will take another few years for the game to be released.
Run!
To pass the time, fans of the franchise can read Sapkowski's latest novel, exploring Geralt's youth.
To unpack the French perspective on the Warsaw meetings and the current situation ahead of the potential peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow, our colleague Anna Kalczynska spoke to His Excellency, the French ambassador to Poland. Etienne de Ponsin, Ambassador of France to Poland. Welcome to the studio, Mr. Ambassador.
Good evening.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So, no security in Europe without the Europeans, and no peace in Ukraine without the Ukrainians. Those are the words of Emmanuel Macron. The French president was in Warsaw yesterday in what has the French press labeled as a round-trip express, and he held talks both with the Prime Minister Donald Tusk and with the President Andrzej Duda. So, did the talks held here in Warsaw yesterday bring us any closer to peace?
Yes, but first, the visit of President Macron to Warsaw, the 12th of December, was a bilateral visit because my president wanted to engage both with Prime Minister Tusk and President Duda after the visit of Prime Minister Tusk to Paris in February, and they want to continue their in-depth dialogue between France and Poland. Of course, as you have mentioned, Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine was at the very heart of the discussion, both with the Prime Minister and with President Duda. And on Ukraine, first, my president wanted to pay sincere tribute to what has been done by Poland to support Ukraine from the very first day of the aggression war of Russia against your neighbor.
Well, the situation is very dire. Only today, 94 ballistic missiles fell on Ukraine. So, understandably, Ukraine says that there can be no peace without security guarantees. So, Emmanuel Macron and Donald Tusk talked yesterday about a potential international peacekeeping force for Ukraine, right? And do you think sending troops to Ukraine can somehow contribute to a long-lasting peace in Ukraine?
But first of all, the two leaders reaffirms clearly their unwavering support to Ukraine, and they pay tribute also to the extraordinary resistance of the Ukrainian people against aggression by Russia. After that, as you have said, the situation is difficult on the ground, and the arrival at the White House of President Trump is also a new element that has to be taken into account. And in this context, they are exchanging notes, exchanging analysis about what can be done, and it is clear that security of Europe is a concern for all European countries, including and the first head, France and Poland, and this should be part of a package. So they exchange their analysis and everything. Nothing should be ruled out in principle.
Well, for the time being, Polish activity in Ukraine would be ruled out. This is what Prime Minister Donald Tusk said. But do you think that Poland could reconsider its position on that if NATO takes a more active role?
We are at the very beginning of the process, the peace process. So it's difficult for the moment to say where we are going to head. But the important, I think, at this moment was to state again very strong principle, nothing about Europe without Europe, and nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So the two leaders were exactly on the same page regarding those matters.
Well, perhaps it's too early to discuss, the venue and the peacemakers that could enable the peacekeeping process. But despite the ongoing war of attrition, both sides seem to signal off the record and send some informal signals about a possibility of holding talks. So now, Emmanuel Macron was the last key figure of European Union to hold talks with Vladimir Putin back to 2022. And he was very involved in the peace process up to the very last moment before the war broke. Do you think Macron's personal devotion to the peace in Ukraine can play a role in this process now?
Things have moved since 2 years, unfortunately, and so my president has not been in contact with President Putin for now years. And so what was before the war was before the war. Now the situation has completely changed. And we have stated clearly many times our unwavering support to Ukraine. And time has not come for France to engage again with the Russians. At this moment, I would, as I've said, the important points are for France to be involved and to engage with President Trump of the United States, and that was what we did at Notre Dame recently. For the first time, having a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky in France, in Europe, at the Élysée Palace, and that was a very strong signal of how France is ready to ease and to the war.
And how does France perceive this dual communication? I mean, on one hand, we have the head of the presidency in the Council, Donald Tusk, holding talks with Emmanuel Macron and with his European counterparts. On the other hand, we see Orban holding talks with Putin on the phone, but still, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs traveling to Moscow.
I will not comment on the Hungarian presidency, but we have a lot of expectation in the incoming Polish presidency, and that's why President Macron was in Warsaw and not in Budapest this week. It's important for France and Poland to consult each other regularly on many issues, many matters. Ukraine was, of course, the most important, but the discussion between President and the Prime Minister were also on other subjects, important subject, European matters, such as Mercosur, for example, where we are
on the same page,
and we are aligned on the same page. And there are a lot of. We look forward for the Polish presidency because Poland has a special role to play in Europe for the next semester, and so there was a very good conversation. And on many issues, we are exactly on the same page between France and Poland.
Mr. Ambassador, it's no secret that the President Macron's visit to Warsaw was cut short due to the engagement domestically. As we know the name of the new Prime Minister, François Bayrou, a close ally of Emmanuel Macron. Will this appointment affect a change, or is it going to be rather a continuation policy?
On external affairs and European affairs, there will be no change because it is in our system. It's the president who is setting the tone of the French external policy, and that was also the case yesterday, in particular when it comes to the French-Polish relationships. And I'm pleased to announce that two leaders on this are also on the same page, and we have decided to launch and to accelerate the process of negotiating a very ambitious new treaty, which is going to be called the Treaty of Nancy, because it's going to be signed in Nancy during the first semester of next year. And this new treaty will show up the new dynamic of the relationships between our two countries. It will be a very comprehensive agreement, a very modern one, an ambitious one, and this will be also a very strong signal. And we are now, as a diplomat, we have been instructed to speed up the negotiation of that important element. Ambassador, thank you very much for taking your time and to getting to us here to the studio. Thank you very much. You're welcome. And that was Etienne de Poncin, Ambassador of France to Poland.
This was an interview by Anna Kalczyńska, and with that, we end our service. But please do stay tuned here on TVP World, as coming up next is On the Record with Adam Yasser.